Since the end of World War II and amplified after the Cold War, Western countries led by the United States wanted to make democracy a leading export. It has not gone smoothly, and in some places it's gone sideways. Shadi Hamid's new book takes a hard look at why. It's called The Problem of Democracy: America, the Middle East, and the Rise and Fall of an Idea. He's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and a contributing writer at The Atlantic. And Shadi Hamid joins us now from Washington, D.C., and it's great to have you on our program, Shadi. How you doing tonight?
Pretty good. Hi, Steve. Thanks for having me.
Not at all. Let's take you back 3+ decades, the fall of the Soviet Union. You write that as Europe and much of the world adopted then to democracy, the Middle East instead moved towards authoritarianism. So let's start there. How come?
Yeah, so we used to support, or the U.S. used to support dictators in Latin America, Asia, Africa throughout the Cold War. And the idea there was it's better to support right-wing dictators than have communist parties or socialist parties rising to power. But with the fall of the Soviet Union and just a decline of the appeal of communism, that started to change in the 1980s. And you start to see the U.S. supporting democratic transitions in those other regions, Brazil, Argentina, South Korea, the Philippines, and so on. And then the 90s come, and then obviously you have the spread of democracy in Eastern Europe, but the Middle East stays as an exception. And one of the reasons is we as Americans have been afraid of what elections might lead to in the Middle East, that democracy can produce outcomes that we find unpalatable. And oftentimes it's religiously oriented parties, also known as Islamist parties, that tend to do quite well in elections across the Middle East. So that's one thing. And the other is that in the 1990s, the priority of the Clinton administration was the Oslo process and pursuing a two-state solution in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And the thinking there was you need to have strong authoritarian leaders to push these peace treaties through, because these are generally anti-Israel populations. So if people vote for whoever they want, then you might not get all that much support for peace. So we actually increased our support to various autocrats. And a peace treaty was signed in Jordan, for example, in 1994. And that became really the key focus of the Clinton administration, where there was a sense that democracy can come later. We have national interests and priorities that take precedence. And that's been part of the story ever since.
So we particularly love democracy, especially when Thomas Jefferson's on the ballot. Only trouble is he hasn't been.
Yes. Exactly.
Okay. There's a new report from a group called Varieties of Democracy Institute. It's an independent think tank out of the University of Gothenburg. It says only 2% of people in the Middle East and North Africa live under liberal democracies. It's the second worst performing region in the world. You could get very, very depressed if you believe in democracy and you believe in its export. You could get very depressed about the state of affairs in that part of the world. Do you?
It's a great question. I actually do sometimes. And 2% is actually a little bit more than I expected. I would have thought it would be closer to 0. So I guess there's a silver lining there. But, in all seriousness, I think that the experience of the Arab Spring was difficult, I think, for a lot of us who work on the Middle East. I was in Tahrir Square the day that Mubarak fell, the dictator of Egypt, on February 11th, 2011. Sure, a lot of viewers remember those images and just how inspiring it was. And then just to see how that all sort of fell apart just in the span of a couple of years, it is sad. And Tunisia was the lone bright spot of the Arab Spring. And even there now, there has been a slow motion coup and a dictatorship is emerging. So it is difficult to look at that and to be positive. I mean, my view is we do the best we can and we try to support the ideas. And as an American who tries to influence policymakers in Washington, D.C., I try to make the best case possible that this is a real mistake. This kind of falling back on supporting dictators after the optimism of the Arab Spring. I really do think that the U.S. has to fundamentally reorient its policy, and that might not happen right away. But my hope is that, you know, with a younger generation of policymakers and analysts, that something different might be possible in the future. But we'll have to wait. It's not looking good for the foreseeable future.
Well, let's stay back then. Let's stay there with the Arab Spring. And you'll forgive the way I put it here, but when the Arab Spring sprung, the Barack Obama administration was in power. Based on your recollection of the time, do you think they saw it, the administration officials of that era, do you think they saw it more as a crisis to be managed or an opportunity to export democracy?
Yeah, so in my book, I interview a number of senior Obama officials who were with Obama in the room at key moments. And there definitely are figures in this story who saw it as a crisis. They saw it as something to manage. They saw it as a nuisance. Because for them, you know, especially if you've been doing policy for several decades, you get used to the fact that there are these dictators that you work with in countries like Egypt, Jordan, Morocco, Saudi Arabia, and so forth. And to see all of that change very quickly, it does unsettle you. And there were younger aides to Obama, such as Ben Rhodes, for example, who were more enthusiastic about the Arab Spring, but there was always this tension between different agencies in the U.S. and different senior officials. And Obama himself actually soured on the Arab Spring pretty quickly. He saw that there was a lot of chaos in the region. There was civil war emerging in Libya and Syria. And also, I think this is a very important part, that in countries like Egypt, you had groups like the Muslim Brotherhood absolutely dominating elections. And liberals and secular parties were doing pretty terribly. So I think that we as Americans, that was hard for us because we think if democracy is good, it will lead to good outcomes. People we like English-speaking young liberal revolutionaries, they're the ones who are going to do well. But what we saw was that is not necessarily the case. When you give people the right to vote in free elections, sometimes they'll choose options that we as Americans don't like. And I think that was a hard thing for people to really fully absorb.
Well, there's that famous line, of course, that elections in the Middle East can often be one person, one vote, one time, and fill in the blanks after that. I think President Obama also once said, "All I need in the Middle East is a few smart autocrats." Now, that's not something you'd expect to hear out of the mouth of a democratically elected president of the United States. I guess you think that reveals hypocrisy at its worst? I don't know. You tell me.
Yes. So that quote, it is really hard to believe. And for people who haven't heard that quote before, it's like, wait, could Obama really have said that? He did. I think it does capture part of his thinking. He just got fed up with the Middle East. And, throughout the interviews that I conducted for the book, that theme kept on coming up, that Obama wanted to pivot to Asia. He wanted to focus on domestic priorities. He didn't want to get more involved in the Middle East. Part of the rise of Obama had to do with disengaging from the Middle East. He wanted to contrast himself with George W. Bush, his predecessor. So I think that you start to see this frustration building on Obama's part. And it's almost like, why can't these Arabs get their stuff together? Like, why is it? And I think there was an unwillingness to look inward and be self-critical and to acknowledge that a big part of the problem was America's own history of involvement in the Middle East. When you've supported authoritarian regimes for decades, from the 1950s onwards, to the tune of tens of billions of dollars of aid and weapon sales and so on, then obviously it's going to be very difficult to change that. And it requires patience. It requires a strategy. And U.S. officials, by and large, didn't have that patience.
Just parenthetically, what do you think Ben Rhodes thinks of the fact that Donald Trump's administration managed to get the Abraham Accords, so some progress on Middle East peace, whereas the Obama administration really didn't?
It's a good point, and this gets to a tension between pursuing Arab-Israeli peace and democracy, because with the Abraham Accords, the countries that signed on to that, for example, the UAE and Bahrain, are two of the most repressive countries in the region, and there was no real popular buy-in. You just have a few very powerful autocrats who kind of make that decision. You don't have to ratify a peace treaty in parliament. You don't have to worry about the polling on how people feel about Israel. So this brings us back to the link that I mentioned in the 1990s, where if you really do prioritize Arab-Israeli peace above all else, you're going to end up prioritizing autocrats. And it's, worth remembering that Trump was very enthusiastic about Arab autocrats. He even joked once about the Egyptian dictator saying he's my favorite dictator. And it was that sort of thing that we saw under Trump. There wasn't even a pretense of caring about democracy. And you might say, at least with Obama, there was the pretense. At least there was some willingness to push, at least in the early period of the Arab Spring. Trump just did away with all of that. And it's an interesting kind of question. Maybe some people would prefer the honesty of Donald Trump, that it's better not to pretend if you're not going to actually take democracy promotion seriously.
Right. Well, you've advanced an idea called democratic minimalism. Why don't you take a moment and tell us what you mean by that?
Yeah, so we as Americans, when we use the word democracy, we pack a lot into it. And usually what we mean is liberal democracy. And by liberalism here, I'm talking about the kind of non-negotiable rights and freedoms that we associate with the American Constitution, the Bill of Rights. So you have an emphasis on the individual over the collective, on reason over revelation, on moving towards minority rights and gender equality. And these are things that we can say are good, they're important, but they're not necessarily always intertwined with democracy. And if we think about democracy in the more minimalistic sense, we're really talking about periodic elections that allow for rotation of power between competing parties and politicians. It's not so much about making people more liberal or having these cultural changes. And I think part of what I try to do in the book is decouple these concepts. And it's not just in the Middle East that we see these tensions. In the U.S., in Western Europe, we have right-wing populist parties who have come to power through democratic elections. And this shows, again, that democracy doesn't necessarily lead to liberal progress. It can lead to anti-immigrant sentiment, Islamophobia, regression on gender equality. We have a debate around abortion rights in this country. So I think that we have to just be careful about how we use these terms, and especially in the Middle East, which is a religiously conservative region, people are going to want to express that religious conservatism in elections. They're going to probably vote for parties that are less secular and less liberal. We don't have to like that as Americans or Westerners, but I think we have to come to terms with that. And we have to say, look, it is up to Egyptians, Jordanians, Tunisians to make their own decisions about the values that they prioritize. And if they don't value the same things that we as Americans do, that's really their choice in the end. And I think this is a more realistic way of approaching democracy, because we can't always get everything that we want from elections. Life is about trade-offs, and so is politics.
Well, let me ask about those trade-offs. And, I'll admit here, this is a bit of an extreme example, but again, following up on where you just left off, is that to say that Americans should be content if, for example, people in Afghanistan actually elect in free and fair elections a Taliban government which pulls women out of schools, inflicts capital punishment for things like blasphemy, isn't remotely close to what we would consider to be, quote unquote, normal Western democratic values. Should we be content with that?
So groups like the Taliban don't even buy into my minimalistic conception of democracy. They don't believe in democratic elections. They took power through brute force. And they've never suggested that they're willing to accept alternation of power, even the existence of other political parties that can challenge them. So for democracy to be meaningful, you do have to have parties. You do have to have alternatives. People do need the right to criticize the government. So in that sense, groups like the Taliban don't even pretend to be interested in that. And so there still has to be some freedom. There still has to be some ability to protest and to make choices. And groups like the Taliban are so extreme that they can't even meet that minimal hurdle. So I'm not saying that anything goes. There still do have to be basic minimal standards that parties and politicians meet, because you don't want a situation where all the other parties are banned. You don't want a situation where people can't even gather in the main square. But I make a distinction between those things which are about the means of politics versus the ends of politics, which are more about cultural and religious values. And there, as long as it's within the Constitution or the legal framework, I do think that we have to be somewhat accepting that some right-wing parties are going to push the boundaries and move in a more culturally or religiously conservative direction. That doesn't mean they can ban women from voting, because then it wouldn't be a democracy. Democracy requires universal suffrage. So there's obviously going to be limits still.
Gotcha. Let me stick with Afghanistan for one more question here. And to do that, I want to quote from a book by Rory Stewart, the former Conservative cabinet minister from the UK, who in 2002 actually walked the entirety of Afghanistan on foot to learn about its people. And here's what he writes. He said, "I now had half a dozen friends working in Afghanistan in embassies, think tanks, international development agencies, the UN, and the Afghan government, controlling projects worth millions of dollars. Their objective was, quote, the creation of a centralized, broad-based, multi-ethnic government committed to democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. Democratization, enhancing capacity, gender, sustainable development. They were mostly in their late 20s or early 30s. They rarely drove their SUVs outside Kabul because their security advisors forbade it. They came from postmodern, secular, globalized states with liberal traditions in law and government. But what did they understand of the thought processes of Sayed Kerbalahi's wife, who had not moved 5 kilometers from her home in 40 years? Or Dr. Habibullah, the vet who carried an automatic weapon in the way they carried briefcases? Okay, to what extent do you think we in the West tried and failed to re-engineer Afghan political culture to match our own?
Yeah, that's really a great quote from Rory Stewart that I think captures this dilemma quite well, that we as outsiders come into these societies and we think there's a linear path to progress, that all peoples and cultures will follow the same way that we did as Westerners. We don't take into account the local context, and we don't look outside of major cities. I mean, part of the problem, a lot of these aid workers and Afghan elites in Kabul, you go outside the city and you see a very different kind of culture. And so when you have these Western educated technocrats, including the last Afghan president, Ashraf Ghani, for example, who everyone in the West was like, he's perfect. He's exactly what we're looking for. But he was out of touch with his own society. And if we can't really understand that and grasp that, we run into problems. And gender was mentioned. The U.S. spent something close to $1 billion on gender-related programs. That's not a bad thing, but to make that the focus or to make that a major plank of the entire US strategy without keeping in mind that that might create a backlash, that maybe you want to go a little bit slower and focus on other things first, setting up a workable political system. And another part of the problem was that the US also created a very strong presidency. And this is generally not good for divided societies because it makes politics into winner takes all. If there's one dominant president and parliament isn't as important, then that's going to be quite polarizing because there can only be one president. So there were a lot of mistakes in the early years of the Afghan nation building process. And look, it's difficult. And that's why I think that when we talk about democracy promotion, we shouldn't think about nation building. We shouldn't think about Iraq and Afghanistan as models that we ever want to repeat. And most of what I call for in the book is actually prioritizing countries that we already have close relationships with, autocratic allies like Egypt that aren't in a state of civil war, civil conflict, and to use our aid to put pressure on them to at least move in a less autocratic direction. I think that's more modest. It's still challenging. It's still ambitious. But that's the kind of democracy promotion that I'm calling for, not the kind that goes into a country and sets up shop for 20 years and tries to re-engineer an entire political culture.
No, I take your point, but putting ourselves in their shoes for a second, is there any particular reason why Middle Eastern countries should depend on the West to help them establish democratic norms in their countries when they no doubt look at us and think, there's nothing over there that looks of particular interest to us, I have to say?
Yeah, well, first of all, as much problems as America has in other Western countries, we still have to remember America is a democracy, a very successful one, and we still do enjoy amazing freedoms that are extremely rare in the Middle East. So I think that if you're coming from that context where you have to worry about the secret police coming at your door at dawn and taking you away on like false charges, I do think there is a lot about the American example that can still inspire for all of our faults. But the reason that the US needs to play a role in the Middle East to encourage democracy is because we are already supporting these autocratic regimes. We are still putting billions of dollars into these regimes. So in some sense, if you're a pro-democracy activist in Egypt, you're fighting two fronts. You're fighting your own government, but you're also fighting the patrons of your government, and that includes the US. And that's why it's very hard for protests to succeed, because you have these militaries that, they interfere in politics, they prevent democratic progress. So at some basic level, the US has to withdraw support from these autocratic structures. Otherwise, it's going to be very, very challenging. And that's precisely what happened in Latin America in the 1980s. The US used to support those autocrats, then it slowly and gradually withdrew support. And that created openings for pro-democracy activists and protesters to really push for change.
Can you imagine them doing that now, though? Because if they were to withdraw somewhat to express their unhappiness with the development or lack thereof of democracy in that part of the world, wouldn't China swoop in tomorrow and simply replace the United States as the big player in town?
That is certainly a fear, but it's very difficult for China to do that on military terms, because these countries have been taking U.S. weapons. Their militaries are U.S. trained. The logistical support that the U.S. gives them, the advanced weapon systems, to make a shift over to Chinese military provisions. First of all, China's not even really offering that, but it would be challenging and almost unprecedented for a country that's part of the U.S. security structure to completely flip in the other direction. And I think that oftentimes, for example, countries like Saudi Arabia that sometimes play footsie with China, they're not actually going to completely shift. They use the threat of them moving to China to make American policymakers nervous. They want to basically tell Americans, listen, be careful about how much pressure you put. But I think we should call their bluff, because they still do fundamentally need the U.S. We do provide a security umbrella for many of these countries. The Saudi regime has depended on America's security umbrella for several decades now. So I think that we have to use that leverage. I mean, China still isn't, it's still not the primary superpower, and it won't be for still some time. So if anything, now is the time for the U.S. to use its leverage before we lose that, if we ever do. And I'm skeptical about the narrative that China is going to replace the U.S., but I suppose that's a different story.
Right. Well, all right, let's finish up on this because, and I guess this will require me to just gently push back a little bit on what you just said, because one does look at the last 20 years of Middle East history and one sees the Americans making endless sacrifices, both in terms of people and blood and treasure, as the expression goes. The United States today talks a whole lot less about terrorism than it used to 15 or 20 years ago. It is energy self-sufficient today, so those relationships with, for example, Saudi Arabia are less than what they were. It seems very focused on China going forward. One does wonder if the United States has, in effect, given up on trying to bring democracy to the Middle East and Northern Africa. What say you?
Yeah, it does sometimes seem like that. I think it's a mistake because President Biden has talked about the central struggle of our time being between democracies and autocracies. And if we're going to make that argument, which I think is a good argument, then it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to make the entire Middle East an exception. It undermines our credibility. It makes us look like we're unserious. If we really believe this is the central struggle of our time and that it matters how countries organize their political systems, then we should act like it and we should be more consistent about it. And this also gets to, I think, a point that is becoming more clear with every year. Saudi Arabia, countries like Saudi Arabia and Egypt are deepening their economic and security cooperation with countries like China, with Russia too. They haven't been on the right side of the Ukraine war. So if we're putting these billions of dollars to these leaders and they won't even align with the US on something as basic as Russia, these are not reliable allies, and it's unsustainable. And I think what I would have hoped the Arab Spring would teach us is that regimes can seem stable, authoritarian regimes, that is, can seem stable until they're not, and then it's too late. And I feel like we're repeating that same mistake over and over. 2 weeks before Mubarak fell in Egypt, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton said, "Our assessment is that the Egyptian regime is stable." 2 weeks later, the regime fell. That tells you something, that you don't want to put too much of your eggs in the authoritarian basket.
Indeed. Very thought-provoking stuff, Shadi. We're so grateful you spared some time for us on TVO tonight. Your book is called The Problem of Democracy, America, the Middle East, and the Rise and Fall of an Idea. Shadi Hamid, thanks so much for joining us tonight.
My pleasure. Thanks so much, Steve.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.